Hello everyone, welcome to World Lab, where we take games apart and figure out what makes them tick. We're looking at Guild Wars 3 again today because Colin Johnson sat down with IGN and revealed two of the core pillars guiding Guild Wars 3 development. We're going to focus on one of them, specifically he called it Joy of Movement. Now, what the heck is Joy of Movement? We know what joy is, we know what movement is, we can put the two together and make that Joy of Movement sandwich, but we don't know specifically what ArenaNet means when they say Joy of Movement. It's probably mounts, probably exploration. It probably means moving through the world in a way that feels fun. I mean, that seems implicit. But deep down inside of this reveal, I think there's a more interesting question. And I think a lot of people who are currently playing Guild Wars 2 are asking it, if only in a subtle way. Why Guild Wars 3? Why not keep expanding on Guild Wars 2? They've spent over a decade adding gliders, mounts, masteries, flying, entire expansions to the game. If they've done such a good job expanding Guild Wars 2, why build an entirely new one? And I think the answer is hidden in this phrase, Joy of Movement. Because I'm thinking that once we understand what ArenaNet means when they say Joy of Movement, we start to understand why Guild Wars 3 exists. Alright, before we jump into this, I'm curious how everyone found this video. Do you think Guild Wars 3 actually needs to exist, or do you think ArenaNet could have just kept expanding Guild Wars 2? Let me know in the comments because I think the answer is more complicated than it looks. Also, like, subscribe, comment, all that fun stuff because doing that helps my video get found by other people. Alright, let's get back to it. When Heart of Thorns dropped in 2015, the glider was added to the game, and suddenly we found a new sense of verticality in a world that was already designed to make us feel small compared to its scale. And I mean XYZ scale, as much as I mean the breadth of Tyria. Some of the environments in both the base game and Heart of Thorns are absolutely enormous, and don't get me started on the underwater environments. Now ArenaNet wasn't just asking how players move across the world, they were asking how players move above them, below them, through them, around them. I imagine ArenaNet poking around at an idea that they hadn't quite put into words yet, not in 2015. Movement should be fun. You can almost hear the conversations. Mounts shouldn't just be movement speed buffs, they should feel like toys. They were circling around the idea, but they hadn't nailed down the design philosophy yet because they were still operating from the original vector. Make this game feel as large as a mainline MMORPG. And then someone said it.
One of the big things that separates Guild Wars 2 from a lot of other MMOs is that how you move through the world is a big part of interacting with it.
We really wanted to push the joy of movement we saw work so well in the past.
You can almost picture somebody writing it on a whiteboard in a conference room. Suddenly, this wasn't an elusive design philosophy anymore. It had a name, Joy of Movement, and it wasn't just a feature, it was becoming part of the Guild Wars identity. The announcement of Path of Fire brought mounts to the world of Tyria. And like gliders, they were going to be usable throughout the entire world. Movement was never going to be the same again, and we were wondering if it was going to be better. It wasn't guaranteed. The new maps were designed around this philosophy, the old ones weren't. But they pulled it off, and they pulled it off spectacularly. The mounts were fun, they weren't just useful, they were fun. Now when I arrive at a traversal problem and switch mounts, it doesn't feel like swapping tools. It feels like I'm pulling out a toy out of a toy box. I'm not just selecting the correct mount, I'm selecting a fun solution. ArenaNet set out to make movement enjoyable, and they succeeded far beyond what anyone was expecting. In an era where games constantly promise big and underdeliver, that was meaningful. What does that have to do with Guild Wars 3 at all? That's from 2017, that's all old news, right?
The two things so far that we've set out as core pillars for the game that we've announced, one of them is Joy of Movement.
Right now, ArenaNet's saying that there are two pillars that are holding up the development of Guild Wars 3, and one of them is Joy of Movement. And here's the thing, we already know what that means. We've played it, we've experienced it, we know what it feels like when ArenaNet designs a world around Joy of Movement. We've been doing it for years. So when ArenaNet says Joy of Movement is one of the two pillars they're using to develop Guild Wars 3, we can draw a lot of conclusions from that. Not because they're telling us directly, but because they've already spent 10 years showing us. But it leaves us with the same question. Why Guild Wars 3? Why not keep iterating on Guild Wars 2? What is it that ArenaNet wants to build that Guild Wars 2 cannot become? So, ArenaNet didn't exactly make us dig around for this one. They've been pretty open about wanting to make Guild Wars 3 a seamless world with fewer loading screens. That might seem like a really throwaway thing to say. Of course, we want less loading screens, we want more of a seamless world. But when you look at how Guild Wars 2 is created, we find that the barrier getting between players and joy of movement is literally barriers. It's zone portals. Guild Wars 2 did its best to soften the problem with things like edge loading. If you're flying toward the edge of one map, the game begins transitioning you into the next one. It's smoother than the old days, but it's still a loading screen, and you're still hitting a boundary. The game stopping and essentially asking you to please wait is a strange interruption when you're hurling yourself through the sky in a sky scale. So let's remove loading screens. Well, we can't. One of the ways that Guild Wars 2 solved the network problem of having a no subscription service online game is that every zone exists on its own server. So when you're waiting in a loading screen, you're not simply moving from one area to another, you're unloading from zone A and loading into zone B. It's a server transfer. And I think this is where we finally start to understand why Guild Wars 3 exists. It's not because Guild Wars 2 failed, it's because Guild Wars 2 succeeded. ArenaNet spent a decade refining joy of movement, and eventually they found the thing getting in the way, the architecture itself. So let's back all the way up to what we know about ArenaNet as a studio that makes video games and has particular design philosophies behind those video games. Is that ArenaNet doesn't ask the question, what does the player want? They ask the question, what's getting in the player's way? What's getting in the player's way are these loading barriers, these zone portals that keep you from being able to go from one area to the other seamlessly. The solution to that is a completely different network solution. Overhauling the entire back end of Guild Wars 2 is essentially the same project as making a whole new game. Actually, it might be harder because you're going to be working with so much legacy code and so much content that would need to shuffle into this new system that a lot of it would probably just break. Guild Wars 3 legitimately is the logical next conclusion. Everyone kind of had an idea that there was going to be a Guild Wars 3, but they weren't exactly sure why it would need to be made. There could be graphics overhauls, maybe we could update some like spectacle, add some new shadowing system, but it was always just going to be Guild Wars 2 enhanced. I don't think it was until we got the Sky Scale that Guild Wars actually needed to start taking a new shape. And in Guild Wars 2, that new shape largely was under the pillar of joy of movement. It happened with the mounts. Specifically, I would guess that the Sky Scale really revealed the barrier between the players and fun because their zones were stuck inside of these instanced environments and individual servers. There is no solution to flying from one zone to another without a load screen. That's not a bad thing. They capped out the engine. They capped out the system that they'd made. They achieved what they set out to achieve. Guild Wars 2 is one of the most popular MMORPGs on the market. Congratulations to ArenaNet. Now, what's the next step? They could do like a lot of the other companies and they could just milk it for all it's worth, or they could innovate. So, joy of movement. For me, it would seem that the most obvious reveal of what Guild Wars 3 is going to be was hiding in plain sight behind a design philosophy that Guild Wars 2 has been using since 2017. Each iteration of Joy of Movement has felt more joyful than the last, and that's what I want to leave behind for new players and people skeptical about the Guild Wars title. Guild Wars 3 is going to be very different from Guild Wars 2, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Guild Wars 2 was built on technology from 2012, and ArenaNet has never been lazy about innovation. It just so happens that the game they want to make doesn't fit inside the game they've already made. So instead of stopping there, they changed the 2 to a 3, and they started building the game they actually want to build. That's ArenaNet. That's 3 dudes leaving Blizzard at the height of its ascent because they wanted to make something new. ArenaNet is still very ArenaNet, and Guild Wars 3 might be the biggest evidence of that we've seen in a very long time.